I'm Kwam Huyam, Jo-Ann Archibald. I'm from Stalo Nation and also have Statlium ancestry. And I am a Professor Emeritus of Educational Studies here at the Faculty of Education. SAGE is supporting Aboriginal graduate enhancement, and this really is a peer support and a faculty mentoring program, and it really started in 2005, and it was started through the efforts of Dr. Graham Hingarella Smith, a Maori scholar of New Zealand, and he had been involved in a program in New Zealand called MAI, M-A-I, which is Maori and Indigenous program. And when Graham was here at UBC for a few years, then he and I thought we should start a similar program here in British Columbia, but we called it SAGE to kind of reflect, the sense of it wasn't based on sage as a medicine, but the acronym has become SAGE. And what we felt was that we could adapt the program to the context of British Columbia and Canada. Now, the goal with the original program, MAI, and with SAGE, is to ensure that that we increase the numbers of Indigenous students who enroll in and complete graduate studies. And we started with a focus on doctoral studies, but we also included students, of course, in a master's program because that's a natural progression going from master's to a doctoral program. But we also felt that we needed to ensure that graduate students involved in their studies had an opportunity to get together, to share experiences, to learn from one another, to talk about their challenges. And we felt that it didn't matter, which graduate program, which university they attended. And we felt it was better that there would be a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary kind of approach to SAGE. And we also focused most on Indigenous students who were involved in graduate studies, but we also included any student, a non-Indigenous student who was involved in an Indigenous topic for their research. And we wanted this program to be more like a family-oriented program. So we set up what we called pods, like family pods in the province. And we had 4 sites, which have, I think been in existence for quite a while now, maybe the last year, not so much, or 2, but we've certainly had a site here in the Vancouver area, which is a partnership with UBC, University of British Columbia, and Simon Fraser University. Has been another site on Vancouver Island at University of Victoria, and one site at the UBC Okanagan campus in Kelowna, and the 4th site has been at the University of Northern British Columbia at Prince George. And so with these 4 sites, what we the principle that we've used over a number of principles for SAGE really is that the graduate students are able to build on their own Indigenous knowledge, and that they can share their Indigenous knowledge for their graduate program. And what we do is have the opportunity for the graduate students to learn about others' Indigenous knowledge through different practices, or also learn through the research that the graduate student is completing. Now, this is not a credit program. It is more of peer support. And then we also added the notion of faculty mentoring. So we have both Indigenous, non-Indigenous faculty members at each site who then work with the graduate students to provide information about different phases of a graduate program, or can get other faculty members to come and give a workshop on data analysis or ethics or particular methodology or particular theory. So we have the SAGE students determine for themselves what they want to have happen in the SAGE sessions for the year. And so they come up with topics or activities that they would like to see happen. And then the faculty member will help with that, and the UBC Faculty of Education through the Office of Indigenous Education has provided the funding for SAGE over the years, and with that little bit of funding can have one of the graduate students be a provincial coordinator, and sometimes there are regional coordinators, and we often encourage the other universities to provide a bit of funding, and sometimes they will fund the local coordination. So over the years then, we've been able to have the 4 sites running based on student input, which really gets back to, with Indian control of Indian education, it's Indigenous people sort of determining, are being quite involved in their education. So I see SAGE as a way to kind of supplement or enhance what the graduate students are doing in their programs. We of course, the faculty members are respectful that graduate students have their program, they have their own supervisor, so we don't take over that role. But if a student has questions, and these come up often about, sometimes faculty members don't understand what it means to have their graduate student undertake an Indigenous topic, or they won't know what an Indigenous methodology is. And so sometimes we can provide opportunities for helping that graduate student articulate examples of Indigenous methodology to their own supervisors or committee, using that as one example. And then the other part is that when I said these were family groupings, it's important that the SAGE members, they feel like they are part of, could be a smaller family if it's in a pod here in UBC SFU, but also to feel that they're part of a bigger extended family. So we have, SAGE has now, I think, taken over a bit more of the responsibility for an annual Indigenous graduate student symposium. And this brings together many graduate students from throughout British Columbia and elsewhere, where they can share their research. And so that means then you have 100 to 150 altogether. So you start out with the idea of here's one person in a program, and often it can be just 1 or 2 Indigenous students in a program, so they may feel kind of isolated. But then when you get together as a pod family, then you might all of a sudden have 10 or so people with whom you can attach yourselves to this. And then you can get to 100 or so. And I think that is really helpful. So that helps with dealing with feelings of isolation, and gives students, I think, I would hope, opportunities to think about how their research can be informed or built upon an Indigenous knowledge system. So, I think those are the important principles of SAGE, that you build on Indigenous knowledge systems, that it creates an opportunity for students to feel like they are part of a family, a community of learners, and that there's also this intergenerational support. So there are, faculty members, and now we have those who were SAGE members at one time who are now faculty members at universities, and they're taking on the faculty mentoring. And of course, we have elders connected to the pods and to the symposium. So there is that intergenerational learning. So I think all of those aspects are uh, uh, successful components, you might say, for good quality Indigenous education. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we know SAGE is successful then? So when I talked about the faculty mentors now who were SAGE members, I think that's a strong indicator of success, that individuals have, were able to get that peer support, to get some mentoring, and they completed their program. But in addition, I think SAGE may have enhanced, their knowledge, their skill development. And then these individuals now, also feel a responsibility, a reciprocity to give back, and are keen to then be mentors to the current SAGE students. So I think we have that. We also have many faculty members who, of course, have gone through SAGE and doing other things, but they're always keen to participate on a panel or in a workshop for SAGE. And, I guess the other part then is to see over the years with the annual Indigenous Graduate Symposium, sort of the range of the research and also the depth of the research now that deals, with basing the research on Indigenous knowledge systems or aspects of indigeneity. And I want to emphasize that SAGE will facilitate all of that, but we don't say you must do an Indigenous methodology. It's really up to the individual, but really SAGE is for those graduate students who want to develop an Indigenous methodology or make their research more relevant to Indigenous communities and people. So if they're interested in that, then SAGE is for them. If they're not, then that's fine. I mean, they can be a part of SAGE, but really, we're really keen to help those who want to ensure that they have a strong Indigenous approach to their research. There was a 3-year research project with SAGE and for the province of British Columbia. And then we, interviewed some of the SAGE members. But I think the most important outcome of that research was that we had the graduate students, and we had hired quite a few graduate students to then develop resources. And these resources were for undergraduate students who, wondered what is graduate studies all about. So we started there because then we thought we need to go now to undergraduate. And then we started the undergraduate SAGE pilot. And through that, we developed lots of material. So if somebody was interested in graduate studies, they'd probably say, where do I start? So we had the various graduate students develop, information about what do you consider when you want to enter a graduate program? What questions should you ask? What criteria for admissions? Then we also had examples, of writing a statement of intent for a master's program or for a doctoral program. We also published a book of stories that graduate students wrote about what's it like to be a graduate student. We had videos developed, so there are short video clips of graduate students talking about their experiences. And so this is a wonderful website that people can still access now, So if undergraduate students are thinking about graduate studies or master's or doctoral, this website still has good information, because we also included, how to be successful at different phases of a graduate program. So I would say that's another indication of success of a program, where you have graduate students who can develop all of these materials based on research. It's Aboriginal Transitions Project, and that should be on the Indigenous Education website and the Faculty of Education. So definitely it needs, I think that's where it will reside as the link, and others can access it. Indigenous education is multifaceted. It can mean education that includes learning about considerations for Indigenous knowledge systems. It can include learning about Indigenous history, policies, current practices in education, and this could be for any learner. And then, on the other hand, Indigenous education could also be focused for Indigenous people, so that the Indigenous people have an opportunity to also learn about Indigenous knowledge systems in all facets of education. But education in this context is probably somewhat more focused to the experiences and the context for Indigenous learners. Since I've recently retired from the University of British Columbia, I look back and I think, well, 10 years ago, where were we? And, the time goes very quickly, and movement is really quite slow. However, I still think that we're at a stage now with Indigenous education that we could probably take big steps in, advancing the success of educational systems. So I think the focus should continue to be on improving educational systems, so that Indigenous learners experience more success. So in one sense, it will be the systems that will actually be the emphasis of success. But of course, it's people working within these systems that will make it successful. But I think that we need to have stronger systemic or institutional policies that relate to curriculum, where everyone learns about Indigenous matters, where racism is still an area that needs to be greatly reduced. And I think that then systems also need to, develop these, could be curriculum policies, admission policies, staffing policies, that in a sense will fulfill the, 1972 Indian Control of Indian Education Policy, which I think set us on an important pathway, and that we continue on that journey, so that we do have Indigenous people as decision makers, Indigenous organizations being very much involved in policy and programmatic development and implementation of programs, and certainly that we expand and deepen how Indigenous knowledge is taken up within the various educational systems. So I think in the next 10 years, if we continue to focus on having all educational systems look at how they address Indigenous education, and continue to kind of monitor what they do, for them to do it themselves, to monitor what they do and to get a sense of what is creating success, what are the barriers for improving success for Indigenous learners, are also improving better understandings of all learners about Indigenous matters. And along with that, I think we also have to put more attention to Indigenous children who are in care, because I think they've been left out, and that I think is becoming, a more prominent issue that, needs to be addressed. And I think we can also do that. I think what's happening in British Columbia is a good start where, at the K-12 level, uh, data has been collected about the annually on Indigenous students' progress. That includes, achievement in subject areas, math, reading. Also, there is a student satisfaction survey that students complete about how they feel about schooling and education they're receiving. And I think that's been an important start. And I think that we need to have some sense of that kind of data that, in a sense, is collected. And really, I think their responsibility is on the educational institutions to do that. But at the same time, I think the provincial and even the federal governments, can have a role in assisting with that. So at least we can have different forms of data to look at. And I think that achievement data is one thing, but I also think we need to expand the notion of what we mean by success and the type of data that's collected. So it doesn't only rely on sort of tests and attendance, but I think we look at qualitative aspects of data too, and trying to get a sense of the satisfaction of students, their parents, and the teachers. So I think there's lots of room for qualitative data or qualitative stories. And I think that can inform a school, a program, a university, on how how the program, had it. Just looking at the success, the experiences, challenges of the program. So I think that type of information is very useful. Of course, along with um, having access to research studies, to publications where programs, those who work with programs are writing about their experiences. So then people can learn from those experiences, and having opportunities to get together in a conference or symposium or a workshop to share experiences.